Good evening, and welcome to News of the World. It's Monday, August 24th. Tonight we drift slowly across 28 countries, from Mali to Romania. There's nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. Mali is a country that dominates headlines for conflict and upheaval. But in Bamako these days, something quieter has been unfolding. Followers of the Tijaniya, a Sufi spiritual order with deep roots across North and West Africa, have come together in the capital for a gathering that speaks to ties older than any modern border. The Tijaniya was founded in the late 18th century in what is now Algeria, and it spread south into the Sahel through trade, scholarship, and pilgrimage. In Mali, it found particularly fertile ground. Today, the order counts millions of adherents across the region, and for many Malians, it sits at the center of daily spiritual life. The gathering in Bamako drew participants from Morocco as well, deepening a connection that runs through shared prayer, shared teaching, and a shared sense of belonging to something larger than the difficulties of the present moment. Morocco has long taken an active interest in the spiritual life of West Africa, and the Tijaniya serves as one of the bridges between them. In a country where so much of the news is about war, displacement, and political uncertainty, a gathering of the faithful might not make the loudest story, but it is the kind of story that endures. People came together to pray, to listen, to remember old bonds, and to quietly strengthen them. And in Bamako, that was enough. Mauritania sits at the edge of the Atlantic, where the desert meets a cold, powerful ocean, and these days that ocean is carrying more than fish. Authorities in Mauritania and Senegal have together halted the departure of more than 750 people who were attempting to reach the Canary Islands, the Spanish archipelago that lies far out to the northwest. These are journeys of extraordinary distance and danger, undertaken in crowded fishing boats across open water that gives no promise of safe arrival. Mauritania's Coast Guard has also rescued more than 300 migrants from the Atlantic in separate operations, pulling people from situations that were already going wrong. The city of Nouadhibou up in the north has become a gathering point for many who make this attempt, a place where the Sahara ends and the next horizon is Spain, or so the hope goes. What drives people onto these boats is not new. It is the same long story of worklessness, of families stretched thin, of a future that feels like it is waiting somewhere else. And the response from the two governments is not new either, but it is worth noting when it happens, because each interception means people brought back to shore instead of lost to a current that does not care about them. If you're still with me, hold this one gently. These are not numbers on a page. They are people who stepped into a boat because they believed the other shore would be kinder. Tonight, most of them are back on solid ground, and that is something, even if the larger question remains unanswered. Tajikistan shares a long, rugged frontier with Afghanistan, over 1,300 kilometers of mountain and river that for years now have drawn the world's nervous attention. So when a spokesman for Afghanistan's current authorities, Zabihullah Mujahid, spoke recently about that border, his words carried a particular weight. He said there is no serious security threat along the Afghanistan-Tajikistan border. He also said no military activity is permitted there. For communities on both sides of that line, that kind of statement matters in a way that goes beyond politics. These are villages and valleys where people graze livestock, trade in small markets, and keep ties that were drawn long before any modern map. The border has been a place of anxiety, a question asked from a distance by people who don't live near it, but closer to the ground, the concern is quieter and more practical. It's about whether the road is open, whether the crossing is calm, whether the season will pass without trouble. Mujahid's reassurance, reported in Afghan media, doesn't erase every question. Borders like this one are never simple, but it is a voice saying deliberately that the intention is stillness, not movement. And in a part of the world that has known far too much of the other kind, that is something worth noting. If you're still with me, hold that for a moment, a long border, and someone saying, "Let it rest." Namibia has been quietly building something ambitious along its southwestern coast, where the wind never really stops and the sun is generous. For a few years now, the country has been talked about as a promising place for green hydrogen, fuel made from water and renewable energy, with almost nothing left behind but oxygen. The early stages were demonstrations, small proofs of concept. Now the conversation is shifting. Namibia is moving beyond demonstration, towards something larger and more lasting. What makes this particular moment interesting is how practical it has become. One Namibian hospitality group, Gondwana Collection, has begun hosting green hydrogen technology that turns wastewater into power, not in some distant industrial zone, but in places where guests stay and rivers of used water need somewhere to go. It is a small thing, maybe, but it points to a larger habit of mind in Namibia, taking what you already have and making it work twice. The country has sun, wind, coastline, and a stubborn willingness to try. If green hydrogen matures here, it could mean jobs, exports, and a cleaner energy grid for neighbors across southern Africa. And if you're still with me, picture that coast at dusk. The turbines turning slowly, the desalination plants humming, and somewhere inland, a lodge running its lights on what used to be wastewater. Not a dream anymore, just the next careful step. Namibia has always known how to live with wide, empty spaces. Now it is learning how to fill them with something quiet and useful, and the night can settle around that. Guinea is a small West African nation, and like many capitals in the region, its largest city, Conakry, has grown faster than the systems meant to support it. This week, that strain turned deadly. A landfill on the city's outskirts gave way in a landslide. Officials say at least 30 people were killed. The details beyond that are still emerging, but what we know is this: the people most likely to be at a landfill are the ones who live nearby, or the ones who make a living from what others throw away. They were the ones caught when the ground moved. A collapse like this isn't just a single moment of failure. It's the end of a long chain of pressure, more waste, less space, unstable ground, and people who have no choice but to be close to it. Guinea has seen difficult days before. It carries the weight of political unrest and deep poverty, and its people have learned to keep going through hardship that would stop most of us in our tracks. But a loss like this lands differently. It's quiet and sudden, and it takes people who were simply doing what they had to do to get by. If you're still with me, hold that for a moment. The families in Conakry who are burying their dead this week, and the neighbors who are left to wonder whether the ground beneath their own homes might one day do the same. Some nights the world asks us to carry more than we'd like. Tonight is one of those. India turned 80 this week, and the celebration traveled a long way from home. In West Ridge, a neighborhood on Chicago's far north side, an Independence Day parade filled the streets with flags and music, and the particular kind of pride that comes from carrying a country with you across an ocean. Indian Americans from across the region gathered to mark 8 decades since India's independence in 1947. And for many, it was a chance to say out loud what that long history means to them personally. On Long Island, too, people paused to reflect on the same milestone, sharing what makes them proud of a country they or their families left, but never quite set down. There is something steady about a diaspora celebration. It is not the fireworks in Delhi or the formal ceremonies at the Red Fort. It is people in a Chicago neighborhood, in late summer light, holding on to a story that is now 3 and 4 generations old and still being told. 80 years is not a long time for a civilization, but it is a full lifetime for a nation in its modern form, and the people in that parade seemed to know it. They carried the flag the way you carry something that belongs to everyone who came before you, and the parade, like all good parades, ended not with a conclusion, but with people lingering on the sidewalk, still talking, not quite ready to go home. Türkiye is marking 55 years of formal ties with China, and these days the relationship is quietly growing into something broader than trade alone. For decades, the connection between Ankara and Beijing sat mostly on cargo manifests, goods moving back and forth across great distances, steady but largely practical. Now, both countries are speaking in terms of strategic cooperation, which is a shift in posture more than a sudden turn. It suggests they are looking past the transaction and asking what else they might build together. The details remain to be filled in, as they always do with relationships between large countries, but the direction is clear enough. Türkiye has long sat at a crossroads, not just geographically, but in the way it weighs partnerships east and west, north and south. A deepening conversation with China doesn't replace other ties. It adds another layer to an already complex stack. And if you're still with me, there's something fitting about the number 55. Long enough to have weathered changes in government, in borders, in the global economy, long enough that the two countries know each other's rhythms reasonably well. What seems to be happening now is less a beginning than a widening, two old acquaintances deciding there is more to talk about than they once thought. The night is settling over Ankara and Istanbul, and somewhere in between the formal statements and the cargo schedules, that conversation continues. Liberia has become a waypoint in a story that isn't really its own. Under an agreement with the United States, the country has agreed to accept up to 1,200 people who are not Liberian, deportees from America, sent to a country most of them have never called home. The arrangement, reportedly backed by a $5 million payment from the US, has now seen its first arrivals. The people coming off those planes face an uncertain future in a place where they have no roots, no family, no language in common. Some, according to reports, refused to go. 5 migrants who resisted the transfer were diverted elsewhere, to Equatorial Guinea. It's worth pausing on what this means for a country like Liberia, which is still building after years of conflict and rebuilding, and which now finds itself in the middle of someone else's immigration policy. Officials have called it not a small issue, and they're right. These are people caught between systems, removed from one country that didn't want them, delivered to another that has no particular reason to know them. Liberia has its own challenges, its own debts and projections and weather and daily life, and now also this. If you're still with me, just hold for a moment the thought of arriving somewhere foreign, not as a traveler, not as a refugee, but as a person sent. It's a quiet kind of displacement, and it's happening now on a coast that has seen so many arrivals and departures before. Cuba has a way of enduring quietly, and these days the quiet is deep. There's a question being asked on the island: who bears the weight of the blockades, the ones imposed from outside and the ones felt from within? It's not an abstract debate. It shows up in fuel lines and empty shelves, in the slow rhythm of getting through a week. From Washington, the approach has been recalibrated. Not a dramatic shift, not a sudden opening, but something more deliberate, a bet on patience, on time doing what confrontation hasn't. The thinking, as reported, stretches toward 2029, a long horizon if you're the one waiting. And from elsewhere, a lifeline of sorts. Russia preparing to send crude oil and fuel, a reminder that Cuba's story is never only between Havana and Washington. Cuba's Deputy Foreign Minister, Carlos Fernández de Cosío, has spoken plainly about the country's position, naming the pressure without flinching from it. Meanwhile, life goes on the way it always does there. People tending gardens, sharing what they have, making do with what arrives. This year also marks 100 years since Fidel Castro's birth. And for some on the island, that anniversary still carries meaning, a reason, they say, that Cuba holds together. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. Not the politics of it, but the ordinary stubbornness of a place that has learned to wait and to keep going while it waits. Myanmar's leader has traveled to Moscow, where Russia's president welcomed him and spoke of energy projects the two countries might build together. It's the kind of meeting that looks straightforward enough. Leaders shaking hands, agreements discussed, photographs taken. But Myanmar these days is a country where the distance between a conference table and the ground has grown very wide. Reports from inside the country tell of an airstrike on a Buddhist monastery, where 14 people were killed as they prayed. A cholera outbreak has taken 3 lives and left hundreds more sick. And villages, according to witnesses, have been burned to clear ground for a Russia-backed economic zone, the very kind of development such meetings are meant to advance. There was other news too. Ethnic Karen fighters withdrew from a town they had briefly held as rival groups moved in. The Navy conducted unannounced military exercises near an island off the western coast, and the country lost a voice that had carried across generations. Kaiser, a beloved pop singer and songwriter who died at 65. If you're still with me, you might notice how all of these stories sit beside each other, the way they do in any country: politics and illness, music and war, all happening at once, all real to the people living inside them. Myanmar is a place where energy deals are discussed in one room, and in another, people are counting what's been lost. The night holds both, and so do we. Bulgaria sits at one of those crossroads that don't make much noise but matter a great deal. For generations, coal has powered this country, dug from the earth in the Maritsa Basin, burned in plants that lit homes and ran factories. It's work that shaped towns, gave people a sense of place. And now Bulgaria is facing the question that hangs over so much of Europe: what comes next, and who gets left behind in the shift? The transition away from coal is not simple anywhere, but here the hurdles are particular. There are jobs tied to the mines, real jobs, in communities where the pit or the plant is the reason a town exists. There are questions about whether the grid can hold without coal's steady baseline. There are political currents too, because any government that moves too fast risks angering the people who depend on that work, and any government that moves too slowly risks falling behind Europe's climate commitments. The funding exists, at least on paper, European mechanisms designed to ease exactly this kind of change. But money doesn't answer everything. It doesn't tell a miner in his 50s what his second act looks like. It doesn't rebuild a town's identity overnight. What's happening in Bulgaria is less a dramatic rupture and more a slow, careful negotiation between past and future, between Brussels and the basin, between what the climate demands and what a community can bear. If you're still with me, hold that thought: a country trying to do right by its people and its sky at the same time. It's not a story with a clean ending. Not yet. Moldova has reached a quiet kind of milestone. A new data protection law, modeled on Europe's GDPR framework, has taken effect, meaning that how personal information is collected, stored, and handled across the country now follows a standard recognizable from Dublin to Tallinn. For a small nation nestled between Romania and Ukraine, this is not a dramatic story. There are no crowds, no ceremonies, but it matters in the way that plumbing matters, quietly underneath everything. If you've ever wondered who holds the record of your doctor's visit, your bank transfer, your child's school enrollment, Moldova is now answering that question with a firmer hand. Organizations will need consent. They'll need to explain what they're keeping and why. People will have the right to ask what's held about them and to have it corrected or erased. None of this arrives overnight. The work of building institutions that can actually enforce such a law, of training officials, of informing citizens, is slow and unglamorous. But it's the kind of step that pulls a country closer to the European family it has been reaching toward, and in a region where borders have been unsettled and skies have not always been safe, there is something steadying about a government turning its attention to the architecture of trust. A law about data may not keep anyone warm at night, but it says something about what a country wants to be, a place where people's lives, even the digital traces of them, are treated with care. If you're still with me, that's the word from Moldova tonight. Algeria has long lived with the double weight of its geology, the vast oil and gas fields beneath the Sahara that power its economy, and the carbon that comes with pulling them to the surface. This week, there's a quiet shift in that story. Sonatrach, Algeria's national energy company, and Eni, its Italian counterpart, have signed a new memorandum of intent aimed at decarbonizing the country's oil and gas sector. The two companies have worked together for years, bound by pipelines that cross the Mediterranean, and by the simple fact that Algeria supplies a great deal of the energy Europe depends on. What this new agreement signals is a willingness to look at that old relationship through a different lens, not abandoning the fields, but asking what it would take to make them cleaner. The details remain to be filled in, as memoranda of intent often are, more a shared direction than a finished plan. But the direction itself matters. Algeria sits at the edge of the desert, a country that knows the cost of heat and the scarcity of water, and where questions about emissions are not abstract. For the engineers in Hassi Messaoud and the policymakers in Algiers, this is a practical conversation about what comes next for an industry that has shaped the nation. And for the listeners still with me tonight, it is a reminder that even the largest stories about energy and climate eventually come down to people, somewhere, deciding to try a different road, a road that for now is only beginning to be marked. In the Marshall Islands, out on a small atoll in the Pacific, there stands a concrete dome. It was built in 1977 when the United States buried 120,000 tons of radioactive waste beneath it, a remnant of years of nuclear testing in these waters. At the time, the idea was simple enough: seal it, cover it, and let it rest. For decades, that is more or less what happened. The dome sat quietly under the sun, and the people of the Marshall Islands carried on with their lives around it. But the Pacific is changing. Rising seas are now pressing closer to that dome, and there is a growing worry that the water could eventually reach what is inside. Concrete, for all its weight, is not permanent, and the ocean, as anyone in these islands will tell you, is patient. The people here have lived with this inheritance for a long time. They did not ask for it, and they have never been able to set it aside. What happens next is not fully known, whether the dome will hold, whether the sea will take what it wants, whether the wider world will pay attention before it does. If you're still with me, just hold that image for a moment. A quiet atoll, a heavy dome, and the tide coming in slowly, steadily, the way it always has. Ethiopia is a country many know for coffee, the place where the bean first grew wild, where the ritual of roasting and pouring is woven into daily life. But these days, something else is growing in the highlands, something a little less expected: wine. French vines from Bordeaux have found a home in Ethiopian soil, and the country is quietly uncorking a boom. The headline from France 24 tells us that these Bordeaux varieties are now driving both exports and rising local demand. It's a small story. In the grand scheme of things, no crisis, no spectacle, just a shift. Farmers and vintners learning the temperaments of grapes that came from far away, coaxing them to flourish at altitude under a different sun. And Ethiopians themselves are reaching for bottles produced closer to home, which is no small thing in a region where imported wine has long held the shelves. There's something steady and hopeful in this. A country already famous for giving the world coffee now turning its attention to another ancient drink, and finding that its land has more to offer than anyone quite expected. The vines are still young by wine's patient measure, but they're settling in. And somewhere in the cool evenings of the Ethiopian highlands, a cork comes out of a bottle that didn't have to cross an ocean to get there. If you're still with me, that's a small thing worth holding as we move along. Turkmenistan sits between the Caspian Sea and the Great Central Asian Plains, a country of quiet corridors and careful diplomacy, and this week it has been strengthening one of its steadiest friendships. Azerbaijan, just across the water, has ratified 5 agreements with Turkmenistan, formalizing a cooperation framework that the two countries have been building for some time. The details of the 5 agreements are modest in the telling, but the gesture is not. It means two neighbors who share a sea and a good deal of history are choosing to keep their doors open to one another, and to keep those doors well oiled. It fits a pattern these days. Tajikistan and Turkmenistan have also signed a foreign ministry cooperation program running through 2027 and 2028. Taliban officials and Turkmen diplomats have been meeting to discuss progress on the long-planned Tapia pipeline, and farther afield, a conference in New Delhi has been looking ahead to a meeting of Turkmenistan's Halk Maslahati and a UN resolution designating 2028 as the year of international law. There is something steady in all of this. A country often described as isolated is in fact talking to many people on many sides about energy and law and the practical business of being a good neighbor. If you're still with me, hold that thought. A country finding its quiet way into the conversation, one agreement at a time. San Marino is a small republic folded into the hills of northern Italy, and this week it found itself at the center of a quiet but deliberate message from Pope Leo. He came for a pastoral visit, and what he offered in return was not just a blessing but a kind of reflection, holding up this tiny place as an example of what he called the care of the human person. It is a striking thing to say about a country you could walk across in an afternoon, but that may have been the point. The Pope spoke about conscience, about liberty, about the dignity that republics are meant to protect. He talked to young people and told them that real freedom is something deeper than choice. It is found, he said, in Jesus Christ, and he spoke about peace. Not peace as a slogan, but as something that has to be chosen again and again against what he called the false realism that worms minds and words and nations. That phrase landed with weight, coming from a region that has known its share of history. San Marino itself is one of the oldest republics in the world, and it has held its independence for centuries through careful, stubborn diplomacy. Maybe that is what the Pope saw, not grandeur, but steadiness, a place that has stayed itself. And if you're still with me, that may be enough to carry into the night, the idea that small things tended with care can become an example without ever raising their voice. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, there is word of a quiet but significant step forward. After talks held in Switzerland, the government and the AFC M23 armed group have agreed on a roadmap for peace negotiations. That word roadmap is modest on purpose. It means the two sides have not yet resolved anything. What they have done is agree on how to begin talking, and in a conflict as long and as painful as this one, that alone is something worth noting. The fighting in eastern Congo has displaced countless people, disrupted lives across the region, and resisted easy solutions for years. So the image that comes to mind is not of a grand ceremony but of two parties sitting across a table somewhere in Switzerland, far from the hills and towns they are trying to bring peace to, and deciding together what the agenda should be. The details of the roadmap have not been shared widely. But the fact that it exists and that both sides have put their names to it suggests a willingness that has not always been there. If you're still with me, you might sit with that for a moment, not with celebration, but with the kind of cautious attention that people in eastern Congo know well. A roadmap is not a destination, it is a direction. And these days, in that part of the world, even a direction feels like something to hold on to. Botswana has long been a country where the land doesn't give up its gifts easily. Much of it is dry, much of it tough, and farming here has always demanded patience. So when something new takes root, it's worth noticing. These days, that something is safflower, a thistle-like plant with bright blooms that's been grown for centuries elsewhere, but is now finding a place in Botswana's fields. The headline tells us production is scaling up, and the aim is clear: food security, and a better deal for the smallholder farmers who do much of the country's growing. Safflower is a practical crop. It tolerates dry conditions, it gives oil from its seeds, and that oil can go to kitchens or to industry. The plant also yields a dye, and its petals have been used in traditional medicines far beyond Botswana's borders. For a farmer working a modest plot, a crop that doesn't ask for much water and still produces something marketable, that's not a small thing. What's quietly promising here is the intention behind it. This isn't about vast commercial estates. It's about the people who farm a few hectares, who carry the uncertainty of each season on their own shoulders. If safflower can steady their income and add another option to what they plant, then it earns its place. And if you're still with me, picture those fields, golden flowers standing in dry earth, catching the last light. A small shift, maybe. But in a land where every harvest matters, small shifts are how things begin to grow. Samoa holds rugby close to its chest. The national team, Manu Samoa, isn't just a squad, it's a name children grow up hearing, a flag carried onto pitches from Apia to Twickenham. So when the chief executive of Lakapi Samoa, the game's governing body there, warns that World Rugby sanctions could bring an end to Manu Samoa entirely, it lands differently than an ordinary administrative dispute. The concern is that penalties being considered at the global level could cut Samoa off from the competitions and structures that keep a national team alive, not just on the scoreboard, but in existence. Details are thin, but the warning itself is plain enough. Without the ability to field teams in recognized international fixtures, a rugby nation doesn't simply pause, it risks fading. For a country where the sport is woven into schoolyards, village greens, and family conversations, that's not a small thing. Samoa's rugby identity has traveled far. You'll find Manu Samoa jerseys in bars in Auckland, in churches in California, in living rooms across the Pacific diaspora. The thought that it could be undone by sanctions rather than by a match result feels, to many, like the wrong kind of ending. Nothing is decided yet. The warning is a call to be heard before the door closes, and for now in Samoa and wherever Samoans are listening, that's enough to hold the night a little more quietly. Guinea-Bissau sits on West Africa's Atlantic coast, a small country of mangrove swamps and scattered islands, and these days its political life is unsettled. The opposition has come out against a proposed referendum, though the details of what that vote would ask remain unclear. What is clear is the mood. Political tension has been building there for some time. A rapper was killed, and that loss sent members of the opposition underground, a sign that the space for public dissent has narrowed. It's the kind of shift that happens quietly in a place like this, where politics has long been fragile and power has changed hands more than once through turbulence rather than ballots. Guinea-Bissau has a young population, and many of them look to figures outside government, musicians, activists, for a voice. When one of those voices is silenced, the silence itself becomes part of the story. The referendum, whatever its contents, has become a kind of test. It asks whether the country can hold a contested vote without the contest turning dangerous. The opposition says no, not now, not this way. And so the conversation continues, not in the streets as openly as before, but in living rooms and messages and the spaces that remain. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. A country weighing its choices carefully, in the half-light, before the morning comes. Monaco is a place used to precision, to things measured closely, whether in casino vaults or on yacht decks. But this week, the precision was out in the open air, on two wheels, and the margin was almost too small to comprehend. The Vuelta a España, one of cycling's three great tours, opened its first stage here, a time trial that began and ended in the Principality. looping through Monte Carlo. Tadej Pogačar, the Slovenian rider already regarded as perhaps the dominant talent of his generation, won the stage. He won it by 9/100ths of a second. That is less than a blink. Two riders side by side in the standings, separated by a fraction so thin it would have vanished inside any honest margin of error in most sports. But cycling keeps its clocks honest, and so the day belonged to him. There was some frustration behind him. Rivals and teams felt the course lent itself too neatly to a rider of his particular gifts, that the contest was effectively over before it had much chance to begin. That is the burden of dominance. When someone is that good, even a fair race can feel unfair. Still, the image worth carrying is the simpler one. A rider alone against the clock, threading through Monaco's short distances and sharp corners, arriving at the line with everything decided by the slimmest imaginable thread, 9/100ths of a second. A whole tour opened on a whisper. Cyprus has formally protested to the United Nations over Turkey's plan to lay an undersea gas pipeline through waters that Cyprus considers its own. It's the kind of dispute that doesn't make a lot of noise in the wider world, but on this island it sits close to the surface. The pipeline would connect Turkey to the breakaway Turkish Cypriot north of the island, and for Greek Cypriots that feels like another line drawn across territory and sovereignty. They have never agreed to surrender. There have been rallies in the south, people gathering to say clearly and together that this should not pass quietly. The Eastern Mediterranean has become a crowded place where questions of energy and questions of history keep tangling together. Gas fields beneath the seabed, pipelines across the water, navies not far away. Analysts have warned that Cyprus could become a flashpoint in the growing tension between Turkey and Israel, two powers whose interests overlap and collide in these waters. It's a heavy word, flashpoint, and for the people who live here, it sits alongside older unfinished arguments about division and belonging. Meanwhile, the island keeps going about its other business, shipping companies adjusting fuel charges, visitors from Libya exploring partnerships in renewable energy, a poker tournament drawing players to the table. Cyprus carries all of it at once. And the protest to the UN is, in its quiet way, a reminder that this island is still asking the world to pay attention to what happens in the sea around it. Switzerland, as a rule, puts its biggest questions directly to its people. Several times a year, voters there receive their ballot papers and decide matters that elsewhere would be left to Parliament alone. This week, one of those questions is about food, what it should cost, who should produce it, and what a small mountain country owes to the people who keep its fields and pastures going. The details are Swiss in their particularity, but the shape of the question will feel familiar almost anywhere. How do you protect local farmers without shutting out the wider world? How do you keep food affordable and still pay the people who grow it enough to live? These are the kinds of questions that don't resolve easily in a legislature, and so Switzerland does what it tends to do: it hands them to the voters and waits. What's striking, as always, is the calm of it. There are campaigns, of course, and opinions on every side, but the act itself is quiet. A voter sits down, perhaps at a kitchen table, perhaps with a cup of something warm, and reads through the booklet that came in the post. Then they make a mark. It's a small gesture, repeated hundreds of thousands of times, and when the counting is done, the country has its answer, or at least its next answer, because in Switzerland the questions have a way of coming back around. And somewhere in Martigny, at a place called Berryland, the great Saint Bernards rest their heavy heads, untroubled by any of it. Timor-Leste sits at the eastern end of the Indonesian archipelago, a young nation whose waters hold both promise and worry. These days, that worry has taken a particular shape. Experts have been raising concerns about the risk assessment for a condensate spill in a project run by Woodside, the Australian energy company. condensate is a light hydrocarbon, less thick than crude oil but still capable of spreading quickly across water. And the Timor Sea is not a vast empty space. It is a place where people fish, where coastlines matter, where a spill would not stay neatly inside a line on a map. The criticism is not loud, but it is pointed. Those looking closely at the project's safety documents say the assessment does not fully account for what could happen if something went wrong, how far the condensate might travel, what it might touch, who might depend on what it touches. For a country like Timor-Leste, where livelihoods and the sea are woven tightly together, a thorough risk assessment is not paperwork, it is a kind of respect, and so the conversation continues quietly in offices and along coasts about what it means to share a sea and what it means to be honest about what could spill from it. The Bahamas has always been a place where the water does the talking, and these days, around the Bimini Islands, what the water is saying is that passage comes with a new cost. The Bimini Marine Corridor, that stretch of sea between the islands that boaters have long used as a kind of watery highway, is entering what some are calling a new fee era. For anyone who has made the crossing, you know the feeling. Bimini sits close enough to Florida that you can almost taste the shift in the air. The water turns that particular shade of blue, the kind that makes you understand why people have been coming here for generations. Fishermen, weekenders, sailors working their way south, they all pass through. Now, the rules of that passage are changing. It is not a dramatic thing, not a storm or a closing. It is more like a toll booth being set up on a road that was always free. The people who manage these waters have decided that transit should carry a fee, and so it will. For the boating community, it means adjusting to a new rhythm, factoring in one more line on the ledger before setting out. For the Bahamas, it is a reminder that even paradise has to be maintained, watched over, paid for. The corridor will still carry its traffic. The blue will still be that blue. If you're still with me, just imagine that water at dusk. The fees are new, but the sea is old and it does not seem to mind. Guatemala has been quietly building ties with its neighbors to protect the digital systems that more and more of daily life depends on. The story that crossed the wires this week is spare on detail, but the shape of it is clear enough. Guatemala is turning to regional partnerships to strengthen its cybersecurity, looking outward rather than trying to go it alone. It's the kind of news that doesn't make much noise. There are no crowds, no ceremonies, no dramatic turns. But in a region where so much attention goes to migration and politics, a government choosing to invest in the quiet infrastructure of digital defense is worth noticing. Think of what runs on those networks now: hospital records, banking, school registrations, the small businesses that have moved their inventories online. When those systems hold, people barely think about them. When they falter, the disruption ripples through ordinary days. So Guatemala is talking with partners, sharing knowledge, building agreements that make the whole region a little more resilient. We don't know the specific countries involved or the exact shape of the arrangements, and I won't guess at those. What we can sit with is the principle that a country looking across its borders for cooperation rather than inward for isolation is choosing the longer, steadier road. And somewhere in Guatemala this week, someone in a government office is doing the unglamorous work of making that choice real. Drafting protocols, reading policy, imagining what a safer network might look like for the people who depend on it. If you're still with me, that's the small, sturdy story from Guatemala tonight. Romania has authorized something quietly remarkable: the Dama Solar Farm, which will be the largest solar energy project in the entire European Union. It's being developed by Resolve Energy, and when complete, it will stretch across open ground in the country's south, turning sunlight into electricity on a scale the region hasn't seen before. Romania has always had the light for it. Long summers roll across the Wallachian plain, and the land around places like Maldareshti holds that heat well past the afternoon. Now that resource will be put to work. The project matters beyond its size. Romania has been working steadily to reshape where its power comes from, balancing older infrastructure like the Cernavoda nuclear plant on the Danube with newer, cleaner generation. The Dama farm fits into that longer effort, one piece in a country rethinking how it keeps the lights on. What gives the story its weight is the ordinariness of it. No dramatic announcement, no crisis driving it, just a decision made in offices, approved on paper, and soon to take shape in steel and glass panels across a field. If you're still with me, picture that field, flat, sunlit, quiet, and somewhere nearby, a village going about its evening, not yet aware that the ground next door is about to become part of something large. The sun sets the same way it always has. The difference is what happens after. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.